All right. Good morning, everybody. Hughes Middle School, Mr. Howe's history students, periods 1, 2, 3, 4, and 7. And last Thursday, I gave you the assignment of doing some reading and to answering some questions at the end of the reading of Chapter 12, Section 1. And it's about the politics of the people. It's about Jacksonian democracy and the beginning of the era that they call the era of Jackson. Very similar to how the early part of the 1800s was called the era of Jefferson. The era of Jackson becomes the next big period of time in U.S. history that we're going to study. Probably the only thing that most of you know about Andrew Jackson is the fact that he is the portrait on the $20 bill. And so we're going to talk about how he became so famous that his portrait is on one of the most exchanged bills in the world. And we'll talk about some of the pluses and minuses and positives and negatives having to do with Andrew Jackson. One of the interesting ways in which Andrew Jackson has come up in the news in the past 3 or 4 years is that President Trump has said that Andrew Jackson is the president that he most admires, which is at the very least interesting and maybe at the very worst kind of terrifying. But also Andrew Jackson's come up in the news because they've talked about taking his portrait off the $20 bill. And we've talked about this in class in the past, and we'll come back and talk about it once we finish with the chapter. But for right now, what I'd like to do is to go over some of the photographs and some of the pictures inside of the section of reading that I asked you to do. So let's do that right now. So the first thing I'd like you to look at is the page in the section that shows, it says America's History Makers, and it shows you portraits of John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And this is the section where it talks about the first presidential election that Jackson was involved in, which he happened to lose, which is the election of 1824. It was a very, very dirty election, like all elections tend to be, with a lot of negative things and untrue things being tossed by both parties and both candidates. The interesting thing is they were both the same political party, because at this point the Federalists had faded away. So all of the candidates that were running in this election were all Democratic Republicans. But one of the features of this election is that it will be a split of the party between the supporters of Jackson, which end up calling themselves Democrats. And it is the birth, basically, of the modern Democratic Party that we have today. And the other side of the party that supported John Quincy Adams, and they took from Democratic Republicans, they took the Republican name and called themselves the National Republicans. Now, it might be logical to think, okay, well, this is the birth of the modern Republican Party, but that's not really true. It is the birth of the modern Democratic Party. Jackson really illustrates the first Democrat that is, still kind of connected to the Democratic Party today. But the National Republicans are just only very loosely related to the Republicans of today, but we'll get more into that later. Before we talk about the details of the election, I wanted to point out that there was a trend that was happening in presidential elections, and one of the trends happened to be that if you had the job of Secretary of State, that seemed to be like a pathway to the presidency. For example, for George Washington, Thomas Jefferson had been his Secretary of State. Later on, Jefferson becomes the president. For Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State had been James Madison, and right after Thomas Jefferson, James Madison becomes the president. While James Madison is the president, James Monroe was his Secretary of State. And right after James Madison, you have James Monroe becoming the president. So it really seemed the fact that John Quincy Adams had been the Secretary of State for James Monroe, that he was being groomed, or at least on a pathway towards the presidency. That was one of the early trends. We also know that not only an old-time trend, but a modern trend is that if you're a military hero, that seems to help you. So you had two trends going on. Andrew Jackson was a well-known military hero from the War of 1812 and his many wars with the Indians in the southeast part of the country. So being a military hero is a big plus. In addition to that, you have the absence of having two competing political parties. They're all Democratic Republicans. In this election, obviously John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson were the two main candidates, but there were two other popular Democratic Republicans who were trying to win the presidency in 1824 too. William Crawford, who was a Southerner, former Secretary of War, and Henry Clay, who was a member of the House of Representatives and had been Speaker of the House. So there's four strong candidates. So after all the mean things that were being said by each candidate about the other, on election day, there being four popular candidates, the electoral votes got split. There were 261 total electoral votes to be won. So because we know that you have to win a majority, it's not about winning the most, you have to win a certain number in order to become the president. And the fact that there were four, relatively popular candidates running, it came out that Jackson had the most, 99, but not a majority that he needed to get. He needed to get to 131. In second place was Adams with 84 electoral votes. Crawford got 41. And what's kind of interesting about that is that a couple of weeks before the election, Crawford had a debilitating stroke, couldn't even get out of bed, and yet he still had a lot of people vote for him, got the third place votes, 41. And then Henry Clay came in fourth place with 37 electoral votes. But you might remember from the election of 1800, in that whole debacle between Jefferson and Burr, if nobody receives a majority of the electoral votes, then the House of Representatives chooses the president. And here we have an interesting turn of events. Jackson got the most, 99 votes, so he expected that the House of Representatives would respect the fact that he got the most electoral votes, and he did also happen to get the most popular votes too. But Henry Clay, who was still in the House of Representatives, kind of swung his support to the second place finisher, John Quincy Adams, and they voted John Quincy Adams to be the president, which just infuriated Jackson and his supporters that the second place finisher should be chosen as the president instead of the first place finisher. But don't forget that they were just going by the rules of the Constitution. All of that was allowed to happen under the law. But here's we get to what they call the corrupt bargain, because right after John Quincy Adams becomes president, who does he appoint to be his Secretary of State? Henry Clay, the guy that swung support in the House to John Quincy Adams over Andrew Jackson. So it does appear that there was some type of deal that might have been made between Henry Clay, in meaning that perhaps Henry Clay said, hey, I'll swing my support to you to become the president, you swing your support to have me become Secretary of State, thereby putting me on that pathway to being the next president. Remember what I said about the trend of Secretary of States becoming the president. So the Jackson followers, and one of the big reasons for the split for the Democratic Republicans, claimed that there had been a corrupt bargain made between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. There's not a lot of historical evidence to support that there actually was a bargain made, but it sure looks like there might have been. All right, let's go on to the next thing I'd like you to look at inside the textbook. And just really quickly on the strange but true, I know we've already talked about it, but it is kind of interesting that John Quincy Adams' father, John Adams, the second president, and Thomas Jefferson did die on exactly the same day, and it happened to be the 4th of July, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. And, we've talked about in depth about how Adams and Jefferson began as friends, then became bitter enemies, and before they passed away, they did kind of rekindle their friendship. They never saw each other again after they were both presidents, but they rekindled their friendship through letters, and the legend is, and it does repeat the legend in this little reading, that Adams, always very competitive with Jefferson, was just frustrated that Jefferson still survives when he passed away, but he didn't know that Jefferson had passed away earlier that day. So just kind of a strange but true situation. This is not really historical, but I think it's interesting. When I say that, I don't think this is super important to know to have a good understanding of the Jacksonian period, but it teaches you a little bit about how Jackson was and what he was about, good and bad. It's a portrait of a locket that Andrew Jackson had of his wife. His wife was named Rachel Jackson, and she actually became part of the election of 1828. Somebody found out that Rachel Jackson had been married before she married Andrew Jackson, and that there was some confusion about the divorce. And what ends up happening is, before her ex-husband was really an ex, she assumed that the papers for the divorce had already been filed. She went ahead and married Andrew Jackson. Well, because the divorce had never been filed for, it was an illegal marriage. So as soon as they were made aware of it within months of getting married, and they very quickly finalized the divorce and then got married. But one of the ways that they attacked Andrew Jackson and Rachel Jackson was that technically, when they married that first time without her being divorced, she was basically living in sin with Andrew Jackson. And for ladies of that time, living with a man when you weren't actually married was a very scandalous thing. And she supposedly was very sensitive to what people were saying and thinking about her. Obviously, there's no medical evidence to suggest that had anything to do with her death. But Jackson, who probably saw firsthand how the accusations affected Rachel Jackson, held it against those people who used the whole first marriage divorce thing against her, and saw how it affected her. So when she did pass away, right after he was elected president in 1828, he said something to the effect, that God may forgive the other people for what they said about my wife, but I never will. And for the rest of his life, he wore this locket that has a portrait of Rachel Jackson and never remarried. So it's just an interesting story that kind of shows how devoted Jackson was to his wife, and how anyone who might have been a part of that election of 1828, he definitely held that against those people. As we move on, just to kind of showing how crazy the inauguration was for Jackson. Of course, he regarded himself as a man of the people. So at his inauguration in March of 1829, thousands and thousands of people came to celebrate this man of the people, this common man president. And they almost destroyed the inside of the White House, because it became basically like an open party in the White House, and Jackson had to be spirited away by his bodyguards as the crowd became kind of rowdy and were throwing things and breaking things and partying too much in the White House. So it's just an example, I think, of the idea of Jackson of being a man of the people. And then there's a little section, you probably skipped right over it, but I'd like to stop and talk about this for a second, because one of the things about Jacksonian democracy is how the people who were considered the voters, it was changing. At the very beginning of our nation, the people who were considered the voters, you had to be white, you had to be a man, you had to be 21, and you had to own property. So a very small number of people could actually vote when our country first started. And Jackson's presidency illustrates the first big change in the evolution of who could vote. For example, now with Jackson's presidency, people who didn't own land, who were white, male, and 21, could vote. So the land owning qualification was the first qualification to be dropped in this evolution of who could be a voter. And just to kind of real quickly show you how that evolution continues, after the Civil War, the 15th Amendment said that the vote could not be denied to people on account of their race. So all males who were 21 gained the right to vote at that point. And then, of course, the gender requirement changes in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. So all citizens, male or female, who are 21 and over can vote starting in 1920. And of course, the final one is going to be in 1971 when the 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18. So you can, when you look at history, you can see the evolution of who was allowed to vote and who gained the right to vote over the years. So I think that's an important thing to take a look at and to realize that that's one of the importances of Jacksonian democracy and Jackson becoming president, is that it kind of shows you that. The last thing I'd like you to take a look at, and to maybe take a little deeper look at it than you did when you were reading the chapter, is the chart that shows some of the differences between Democratic Republican Jefferson and then Democrat Jackson. So you have Jeffersonian democracy and you have Jacksonian democracy. Similar ideas. They were technically contemporaries, meaning that they were alive at the same time at some point. Jefferson dies in 1826. Jackson becomes president in 1828. So they had to have known of each other. Jefferson never expressed publicly how he felt about Jackson. We know from private letters that Jefferson really thought Jackson was dangerous and was the kind of leader that he said we should fear, that he seemed to be eager for power. Jefferson preferred someone more like Washington, who was a reluctant leader, someone who would be reluctant to want to take power and to become like a dictator. But he thought Jackson was relatively dangerous. Jackson admired Jefferson. We know that as a Democratic Republican, he looked back and admired, Jefferson's thinking and the idea of the common man. You might remember that from Jeffersonian democracy, and Jackson was also known as common man. But one thing that both Jefferson and Jackson had in common is that they really weren't common at the height of their power. They were actually very, very wealthy people. Both slave owners, both had this idea of having limited government, but of course, Jackson wasn't afraid to be also a powerful president. So I think this chart's important for you to take a look at and to understand about how there are some similarities between Jefferson and Jackson, but also some very, very clear differences. And then at the bottom of this page, of course, we get to the section assessment. And so let's now start going over the terms and the names, the using graphics, the main ideas, and the critical thinking question. So now take a look at your terms and names. We talked a lot about John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. So make sure you have something written about them that says that John Quincy Adams was the 6th president of the United States, only served one term. And Andrew Jackson was the military hero and 7th president of the United States, serving 2 terms. Probably the biggest idea to understand is Jacksonian democracy. There's going to be a couple of things we're going to talk about in the main idea questions too. But we saw that big chart about the differences between Jeffersonian democracy and Jacksonian democracy. And one of the aspects of Jacksonian democracy that we're going to talk about a lot is the spoils system. And something I know we already kind of talked about, the fact how that's been going on forever in terms of new presidents hiring and firing people that when they become the president. But that becomes a real big part of Jackson's presidency. And then I know a lot of you guys on the using graphics section, you did that chart about the life of Andrew Jackson and his rags to riches story. But another big part, and I'd like you to go ahead and make this chart on your notes as well, or your section assessments as well. And just make this bubble chart. You know, the whole point of things like thinking maps, like bubble charts, is that it helps you organize your thoughts before you have to write about them. And if I were to ask you to write a quick little paragraph about Jacksonian democracy, here are 4 ideas that you might want to mention in that paragraph. So, for example, how Jacksonian democracy was part of it is understanding how new people could vote that couldn't vote before. White males who were 21 who didn't own property could now vote during this time period. Jacksonian democracy goes along with Jeffersonian democracy as being a party of the common man. How farmers in the West were gaining in power and importance during Jacksonian democracy, and how the spoils system was part of Jacksonian democracy, that idea that to the victor go the spoils. So now we're going to go over the main idea questions that you wanted to answer. Don't forget the standard is 2 sentences or 2 bullets. And one of the cool things about doing this with YouTube is that if I am going too fast for you, feel free to pause the video and to add to your answer if you had an answer that wasn't entirely correct, or if you got the wrong idea. This is your chance to fix it. So the first question was on letter A. How did Andrew Jackson react to the election of 1824, and why? And take a look at your answer and compare it to this. And we can talk about how he felt outraged because it appeared to him that the presidency was stolen from him. The House of Representatives voted John Quincy Adams to become the president, even though Jackson had won the most popular and the most electoral votes, but not a majority as required by the Constitution. We talked in detail about that when we went over the textbook a second ago. So at this point, if there's some things you'd like to add to your answer, go ahead and pause the YouTube video so you can write down some ideas. And now let's take a look at letter B. The question was, what factors helped Jackson win the presidency in 1828? So we're talking 4 years later. John Quincy Adams did not have a very successful 4 years between 1824 and 1828 because the Democrats who favored Jackson opposed almost all of his issues in Congress. So what factors helped him win the presidency in 1828? And take a look at your answer and see how well it matches with this. One of the big factors was the first big change in voting requirements, because Jackson was born into a, quote, common background, rising to wealth and power through luck, determination, and hard work, and maybe a little bit of stealing land from the Indians. He appealed to a great number of common people. The ineffectiveness of the John Quincy Adams administration also helped Jackson win the presidency. So once again, if I'm going a bit too fast for you, if there's some ideas that you'd like to add to your ideas, go ahead and pause the YouTube video right here so you can continue to add some ideas to your notes. And then we get to letter C. What was the effect of expanding voting rights? And take a look at your answer, see how it compares with this, and feel free to add a couple of ideas if you need to. By the election of 1828, the, quote, land owning, quote, end quote, requirement had been dropped by all of the states. In this election, one only had to be a white male citizen and 21 or over. This led to the election of a president who was a, quote, champion of the common people, end quote, but don't forget he wasn't very common himself. He was super rich, even though Jackson was in fact very wealthy. Once again, feel free to pause and write down some ideas that maybe you didn't have on your answer. And then the critical thinking was not required, but I'm going to go ahead and go over it with those students who wanted to extend themselves and challenge themselves a little bit by doing some critical thinking. And the question is, what are some reasons for and against the so-called spoils system? And you can take a look here. The term comes from the phrase, quote, "To the victors belong the spoils," end quote. It came to mean during Jackson's presidency that a new president would fire the old president's executive branch federal employees and put his own supporters into their jobs. On one hand, it broke up one group's hold on the government's jobs. On the other hand, it was just a way to reward political supporters who may not be qualified for their jobs. It's very common today when a new president, especially if it's a president from a new party, that they're going to fire all of the executive branch secretaries and undersecretaries and all the people that, not all the people, but a lot of people that have big decision-making powers, and put into place people who would more likely agree with the president's policies. So the spoil system in this case really reached down to even some of the lower levels of the executive branch that today a president wouldn't necessarily worry about. But so take a look at your answer, and if your answer is similar to mine, if you'd like to add some ideas to your answer, feel free to pause the video and write down some ideas. So just to give you a model again, and you want to have an idea if your paper is looking the way that it should be looking. This is a model from a different section assessment from another student from years gone by. Do you have a section of terms and names? And are the terms highlighted with a definition that comes after them? Do you have a bubble map that shows Jacksonian democracy? It won't be a chart like this because this is a different section assessment, but do you have a bubble map that has a graphic organizer or a thinking map to help you write a paragraph if that was something that I asked you to do? Do you have main idea questions that are written out and with the questions highlighted and answers following the highlighted questions? It might be just underlined, doesn't have to be highlighted, or put a box around it. So do your main ideas look something like this? If they don't, you may want to reformat them. Do you have some extra notes written down? Because that might mean that will show me that you're really paying close attention and you're actively engaged in the learning. And the critical thinking question, don't forget that is not required. But if you did it, congratulations. I appreciate you putting in some extra effort to your work and going above and beyond. All right, so that's Chapter 12, Section 1. I hope that you completed it, and if you had any questions about it, you were able to fix your answers on your questions. And if there's anything that you would like to email me about and comment on, if you found something interesting about Jackson you'd like to ask me a question about or make a comment on, please go ahead and email me on School Loop, and I'll answer them as fast as I can. Thanks a lot and have a great day.